Dakota Territory, August 1887. The sun was a hammer on an anvil of baked earth. Dust rose in lazy plumes from the hooves of passing horses, coating everything in a fine ochre powder. Yet Alara Vance was digging, not for a well, nor for the foundations of a new barn. She was digging a hole, a massive gaping cavity next to her small but well-built timber cabin. Day after day, she worked with a quiet, relentless rhythm. The shovel was an extension of her arms, the wheelbarrow a partner in her singular, confounding task. The other settlers of the small Prairie Rose community watched. At first, they were curious. Then they became concerned. By the third week, as the hole grew deeper and wider than any root cellar they had ever seen, their concern curdled into open mockery. Silas Thorne, the man who had built nearly every sturdy structure in the valley, leaned against a fence post, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. He was a master carpenter, a man whose opinion on lumber and foundations was treated as gospel. He watched Alara haul another barrow full of earth, her face set in a mask of concentration. "It's a grave she's digging," he remarked to a neighbor, not bothering to lower his voice. "A grave for common sense." The neighbor chuckled, and the name was born. They called it Alara's Folly. She heard them. She saw their gestures, the way they shook their heads as they passed on the dusty track to the trading post. But she never stopped digging. What did this quiet woman, a widow who had arrived only 2 years prior from a land no one had ever heard of, understand about a Dakota winter that every seasoned frontiersman had supposedly missed? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because the answer would not only save her family, but it would fundamentally rewrite the rules of survival on the northern plains. To understand her folly, you must first understand the fear. Winter in the Dakota Territory was not a season. It was a predator. It stalked the plains from November to April, a relentless, howling beast of wind and cold. It was a physical presence that seeped through the thickest logs and stole the breath from your lungs. The settlers fought it with the only weapons they knew: fire and wood. A cabin's worth was measured by the height of its woodpile. A family's security was counted in cords. All autumn, the air rang with the sound of axes and saws, a frantic preparation for the siege to come. But it was a losing war. The standard cabins, built by capable men like Silas Thorne, were marvels of frontier engineering. They were tight, chinked with mud and moss, with stone fireplaces that could swallow a log whole. And yet they failed. The cold was too profound, too invasive. It found every microscopic crack. It laid a glittering sheath of frost on the inside of the walls, even as the fire roared. Families would huddle close to the hearth, their fronts roasting while their backs remained chilled. Water barrels froze solid indoors. Ink turned to black ice in its wells. A man's beard would crystallize with his own breath the moment he stepped from the fireside. The true enemy was consumption. The cabins consumed firewood at a terrifying rate. A woodpile that looked like a fortress in October would be a mere skirmish line by January. The desperate math of winter governed every life. How many logs to burn today to stay alive, versus how many to save for the brutal depths of February? Sometimes the math was wrong. Every settler knew of a family that had started burning furniture, then floorboards, to make it to the spring thaw. Some didn't make it at all. This was the reality Alara Vance had observed during her first 2 winters. She watched her neighbors, good and hard-working people, trapped in a cycle of endless labor for a brief, fleeting warmth. She saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the constant low-grade fear that hummed beneath the surface of their lives. Alara knew a different way. She had not come from the gentle hills of Ohio or the forests of New England. She was from a harsh, sun-blasted region of the Old World, where the people had learned centuries ago that the greatest shelter was not built upon the earth, but within it. In her homeland, the temperature could swing wildly, from scorching summer heat to bitter winter winds. But the earth itself remained constant. A few feet below the surface, the ground held a steady, cool temperature in the summer and a gentle, reliable warmth in the winter. The earth was a massive battery, storing the memory of summer's heat. Her ancestors had not fought the elements. They had partnered with the ground beneath their feet. She looked at the vast, deep soil of the Dakotas, and she didn't see a flat, hostile plain. She saw a reservoir of untapped warmth, a shield waiting to be used. Her neighbors saw only the howling wind. She saw the silent stillness just a few feet down. And so, she began to dig. Her plan was not to build a simple root cellar. It was to create a second, subterranean living space, connected to her cabin, that would borrow its heat directly from the thermal mass of the planet. The construction of Alara's Folly became the primary source of entertainment in Prairie Rose. She started by digging a shaft, 10 feet deep and nearly 15 feet square, directly adjacent to the north wall of her cabin. This was the most brutal work, accomplished with nothing but a spade, a pickaxe, and a wooden ramp to haul the earth out with her wheelbarrow. Once the main chamber was excavated, she shored up the walls with thick timbers salvaged from a collapsed barn, leaving no gaps. The ceiling was a dense lattice of logs, which she then covered with oiled canvas, and finally, a 3-foot layer of the excavated earth itself. She built a sturdy staircase leading down from a new trapdoor she cut into her cabin's floor. But this was only the bunker. The true genius of the design, the part that earned her the most ridicule, was the lung. She spent a week trenching a narrow channel, running 100 feet out from the base of the subterranean room. It was a difficult, painstaking task. At the bottom of this trench, more than 7 feet below the surface, she laid a pipe. It was a crude thing, fashioned from sections of hollowed-out log, carefully fitted and sealed with pine tar and pitch. This pipe, this earth tube, was the heart of her system. Its intake was a simple stone-lined opening 100 feet from the house, capped with a grate to keep animals out. The other end opened into the floor of her underground room. Silas Thorne came to inspect her work when he heard about the pipe. He stood at the edge of the pit, his shadow falling over Alara as she worked. He was not a cruel man, but he was a proud one, a man whose identity was tied to his mastery of conventional building. "Alara," he said, his voice laced with a genuine, if condescending, concern. "I've built 30 homes in this territory. I know what the cold does. What you're doing here is inviting disaster." Alara paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dusty glove. "How so, Mr. Thorne?" "That ground sweats," he said, pointing a thick finger at the earthen walls. "In the winter, the warmer, moist air from your cabin will hit that cold dirt and the cold air from that pipe. Your walls will weep. Then they will freeze. You're building an icebox, not a shelter. Your children will be sleeping inside a block of ice." Alara looked at her work, then back at him. Her reply was simple. "The earth is not cold, Mr. Thorne. Not down here." He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "And that pipe, what is that for? To draw the winter air directly into your home. It will be a river of cold. You'll never keep a fire lit against that draft." "It is a lung," she said quietly. "It will breathe for the house." He shook his head, a look of pity on his face. He truly believed he was watching a woman, addled by grief and loneliness, digging a tomb for her family. He tried one last time. "You're wasting good timber on this burrow. Let me help you build a proper second wall on the north side of your cabin. A dead airspace. That's the proven way." "I am grateful for the offer," Alara replied, turning back to her work. "But I will see this through." Silas walked away, telling everyone at the trading post that evening that the widow Vance was not just foolish, but dangerously stubborn. The mockery intensified. Children would run past her property yelling, "Hello, gopher!" The women of the community would whisper at the Sunday social, convinced she was putting her two young children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, in mortal peril. Alara ignored them all. Her final piece of the system was the chimney. From the ceiling of the underground room, she built a small, insulated flue that ran up through her cabin's main floor and terminated in a small, hooded vent on her roof. This was the exhale to the earth tube's inhale. The physics were simple, elegant, and entirely alien to the settlers. The fire in her main cabin stove would consume air, creating a slight negative pressure in the house. This would draw new air into the system. But instead of pulling frigid air through cracks in the walls, it would pull it through the 100-foot-long underground pipe. As the sub-zero winter air traveled through that pipe, buried 7 feet deep in earth that was a constant 50 degrees Fahrenheit, it would be passively pre-warmed. By the time it entered the subterranean room, air that was minus 20 degrees outside would be a balmy 45 or 50 degrees. This temperate air would then rise into the cabin above, feeding the fire and filling the living space. The small chimney flue would expel the cooler, moisture-laden air from the lower room, creating a constant, gentle circulation. It was a closed loop, a convection engine powered by the earth itself. By the time the first snows fell in late October, Alara's folly was complete. From the outside, nothing looked different except for a small, stone-lined hole in the prairie 100 feet away and a new, tiny vent on her roof. The vast, life-giving structure was completely invisible, buried beneath the ground. The community saw nothing and assumed her summer's madness had simply been buried and forgotten. They had no idea they were all standing on the answer to their prayers. Then December came. It arrived not as a gentle slide into winter, but as a plummet. The temperature dropped with a terrifying velocity. The old-timers felt it in their bones, a deep, resonant cold they hadn't experienced in a decade. The sky turned a metallic, unforgiving gray. The first day of the great blizzard, the temperature at dawn was 10 degrees above zero. By sunset, it was 10 below. The wind rose to a steady, shrieking howl that did not cease for days. It picked up the loose snow and turned the world into a churning, white chaos where visibility was measured in feet. This was the test. This was the crucible that would either validate Alara's strange knowledge or confirm everyone's worst fears. In the cabins of Prairie Rose, The familiar battle began, but this time it was different. The cold was more intense, more penetrating. Silas Thorne, in his own home, a model of frontier craftsmanship, felt it immediately. The logs of his cabin groaned in the cold. The wind forced its way through the chinking, creating tiny whistling drafts that cut like knives. He kept the great stone fireplace roaring. His son was tasked with a single job: bring more wood. The pile on the porch, which should have lasted a week, was half gone in a day. The heat radiated only 5 feet from the hearth. Beyond that small circle of warmth, the cabin was a frigid tomb. His wife and daughters huddled under a mountain of quilts, their breath pluming in the air. The water in the bucket by the door, just 12 feet from the fire, was a solid block of ice. On the second day, the temperature fell to 25 below zero. The wind chill was a number no one dared to calculate. Word trickled through that the few brave souls who checked on their neighbors that the Miller family had lost 3 of their cattle, frozen, standing in their barn. The Jacksons were already burning a broken wagon for fuel. Silas felt a gnawing dread. His own expertise was failing him. He had done everything right, everything according to the hard-won wisdom of the frontier. He had built his walls thick. His fireplace drew perfectly. His roof was sound. Yet his family was freezing, and his woodpile was shrinking with apocalyptic speed. He was a captain on a masterfully built ship, sinking in a sea he thought he had charted. By the morning of the third day, a new fear began to creep into his mind, colder than the wind outside. It was the thought of Alara Vance and her 2 children. He pictured them in their folly, their foolish burrow. He imagined the weeping frozen walls he had predicted. He envisioned the frigid draft from that insane pipe, extinguishing their fire, leaving them to freeze in the dark. The mockery he had felt all summer curdled into a thick, choking guilt. He had stood by, so certain in his own knowledge, and watched a widow build a death trap. What if her fire had gone out 2 days ago? What if they were already gone, frozen solid in their earthen tomb, because no one had the sense to stop her? The thought became unbearable. He had to know. He had to go and see. Maybe he could bring them back to his own cabin. As cold as it was still better than a grave. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and canvas he owned. He pulled on his thickest mittens and wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible. He told his wife he was going to check on the widow Vance. The look she gave him was one of pure terror. To go out in this storm was to risk death. The journey was a scant 300 yards, but it was a polar expedition. The wind was a solid wall, shoving him, stealing his breath, trying to rip the heat from his body. The snow was whipped into deep, treacherous drifts. Every step was a battle. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, a sharp, searing pain deep in his lungs. By the time he saw the faint outline of her cabin through the white maelstrom, his beard was a solid mass of ice. He stumbled onto her porch, his body screaming with cold, his mind braced for the horror he was sure he would find inside. He expected to see the windows opaque with thick frost. He expected silence. He expected death. This is the moment where everything you think you know about survival is about to be proven wrong. And if you believe in the power of forgotten wisdom, take a moment to hit that like button right now, because what Silas Thorne found inside that cabin would change his life and this entire community forever. He hammered on the door with a numb fist, shouting Alara's name, his voice swallowed by the storm. He waited. No answer. A spike of pure panic shot through him. He was too late. He put his shoulder to the door, ready to break it down, to face the grim task ahead. Just as his weight hit the wood, the latch clicked and the door swung inward. It was not a wave of cold that met him. It was a wall of warmth, a dense, humid, living warmth that struck his frozen face like a physical blow. It was so shocking, so utterly impossible, that for a moment he simply stood there, staggering on the threshold, unable to process the sensory data. He stumbled inside and pushed the door shut against the raging storm. He leaned against it, his lungs heaving, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light of the cabin. The air didn't just feel warm, it smelled of baking bread and wood smoke and life. He slowly unwrapped the scarf from his face. His gaze swept the room, and his world tilted on its axis. There was no frost on the windows. None. The glass was clear, showing only the swirling white chaos outside. Alara Vance stood by the stove, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a dusting of flour on her forearms. She was watching him with a calm, questioning expression. And then he saw the children. Her son, David, and her daughter, Anna, were sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, far from the stove. They were playing with carved wooden figures. They were in their bare feet, on the floorboards, in the middle of a blizzard that had frozen cattle in their tracks. Silas felt his mind struggling to reconcile the reality outside with the impossible domestic peace inside this cabin. He had just walked through a world of -30 degrees, and he had stepped into a room that felt like a mild spring day. "Mr. Thorne," Alara said, her voice even, "you are a long way from home in this storm. Are you well?" He couldn't form words. He could only stare. His eyes, the eyes of a master builder, began to investigate. He looked at the stove. It was a small, efficient, cast-iron model, not a great roaring fireplace like his own. The fire within was banked low, a gentle, steady burn, not a ravenous inferno. He looked at the wood box next to it. It was not empty. It was not even low. It was nearly full. He walked, almost in a trance, to the north wall of the cabin, the wall that faced the full, screaming fury of the wind. In his own home, this wall was coated in a thick layer of ice. He reached out a trembling, half-frozen hand and pressed his palm flat against the logs. They were not cold. They were not even cool. They were neutral. They felt like the inside of a house. There was no radiating chill, no hint of the Arctic apocalypse happening just inches away. He turned back to Alara, his face a mask of confusion and awe. "How?" he whispered, the single word hoarse and raw. "Your fire. It's so small. How is this possible?" "We are not heating the cabin, Mr. Thorne," she said simply. "We are heating the air that comes into it." She led him to the trapdoor in the floor. She lifted it, and another wave of even warmer, slightly damp, earthy-smelling air rose to meet them. He peered down the staircase into the subterranean room. A single lantern cast a soft glow on the timber walls. It was down there, in the quiet, insulated heart of the earth, that the miracle was happening. He descended the stairs slowly, like a man entering a sacred place. The air in the lower chamber was noticeably warmer than the cabin above. He could feel the gentle, constant draft coming from the opening of the earth tube in the floor. He put his hand in front of it. The air flowing out was not cold. It was shockingly mild. He could feel the life-giving breath of the deep earth. He looked at the earthen walls. They were not weeping. They were not frozen. They were dry to the touch, radiating a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. He finally understood. Alara hadn't built an icebox. She had built a heat exchanger. She was using the planet itself as a furnace. He climbed back up the stairs, his mind reeling with the implications. The data. He needed the data. "How much wood have you burned?" he asked, his voice urgent. Alara glanced at her woodpile, the one neatly stacked against the south wall of her cabin. "Since the storm began? Perhaps a quarter of a cord." The numbers hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. A quarter of a cord. In 3 days. He and his family had burned through that nearly a full cord and a half, and they were still freezing. She had used less than 1/5 of the fuel to achieve a level of comfort he would have thought impossible. The efficiency was staggering. It was revolutionary. He looked at the thermometer hanging by the door. It read 68 degrees. 68 degrees. While the world outside was 30 below. A full 100-degree difference, maintained with a tiny sipping fire. The numbers were undeniable. The proof was in the barefoot children, the clear windows, the full woodbox. The proof was in the gentle, warm air he was breathing. He turned to face Alara. The arrogance and certainty that had defined him had been scoured away by the storm outside and the truth inside her home. All that was left was a raw, humbling awe. He looked at this quiet woman, whom he had pitied and mocked, and he saw not a fool, but a genius. "I was wrong," he said, and the words felt heavy and liberating all at once. "I was completely and utterly wrong. What you have built here, it works." He paused, looking around the warm, safe room. "Alara, will you teach me?" When the great blizzard finally broke 2 days later, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white under a brittle blue sky, the stories began to emerge. Stories of hardship, of loss, of near disaster. But from the Vance cabin, a different story emerged. It was carried first by Silas Thorne. He became Alara's most fervent advocate. He went from cabin to cabin, his voice filled with the zeal of a convert, and he told them what he had seen. He described the barefoot children. He repeated the numbers: 68 degrees inside, a quarter cord of wood. Most didn't believe him. It sounded like a fever dream, a fantasy born of the storm's madness. So he brought them. He led a small procession of the valley's most respected elders to her cabin. They stepped inside, one by one, from the biting cold into the impossible warmth, and they experienced the same disorienting shock that he had. They touched the walls. They felt the air from the cellar. They saw the proof with their own eyes. The ridicule that had surrounded Alara's folly evaporated. It was replaced by a tide of awe and desperate interest. The project's name changed. First, they called it the Warm Room, then the Vance Cellar. Eventually, it became known simply as a burrow. To build a burrow became the new standard, the ultimate goal for any family serious about surviving a Dakota winter. That spring, Alara Vance did not have to dig alone. Silas Thorne was at her side, along with a dozen other men from the community. They were not digging for her, they were digging for themselves, and she was their teacher. She moved from homestead to homestead, a quiet, unassuming instructor. She showed them how to site the chamber on the north side of a house to act as a thermal buffer. She explained the critical importance of the pipe's depth and length. Too shallow, and it would draw cold. Too short, and the air wouldn't have time to warm. She taught them how to engineer the convective loop, balancing the intake with the chimney flue to ensure fresh air without creating a noticeable draft. Silas, with his builder's mind, quickly grasped the principles and began innovating. He helped neighbors integrate the designs into existing cabins, devised a more durable clay pipe system to replace the hollowed logs, and worked out the ideal dimensions for a family of 5 versus a family of 2. He never took credit. When anyone praised his work, he would simply shake his head and say, "This is Alara's knowledge. I am just the carpenter." The transformation of the Prairie Rose community was profound. The following winter was just as cold, but the fear was gone. The frantic, desperate consumption of firewood ceased. The winters were no longer a siege to be endured, but simply a quiet season of rest. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human lives. It was measured in the babies who survived their first winter without the constant threat of respiratory illness from the cold, damp air. It was measured in the elderly who could live with dignity, not huddled in a single chair by a fire. It was measured in the laughter of children who could now play on the floor of their homes in January. Alara's idea had given her community not just warmth, but peace. She never sought fame or payment, content in the quiet satisfaction of having shared a better way to live. The story of Alara Vance and her burrow is a powerful reminder of how often true innovation comes from the margins. It demonstrates that sometimes the most advanced knowledge is not a new invention, but ancient wisdom, remembered and reapplied. The principles she used, geothermal heat exchange and thermal mass, are not magic. They are fundamental laws of physics. Today, we see these same concepts at work in advanced, multi-million-dollar passive houses and green building designs that use ground source heat pumps and earth-sheltered construction to slash energy consumption. They are hailed as cutting-edge technology, the way of the future. But the core idea is as old as the hills themselves. It's the simple, profound truth that the greatest source of shelter and stability is often the very ground we stand upon. If this story of frontier ingenuity changed how you think about the world beneath your feet, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten history. And drop a comment below telling us, what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? We'd love to hear your story. Please note, the account you have just heard is a fictionalized narrative created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and scientific principles of geothermal heat exchange and earth-sheltered building are very real and have been used historically in various forms around the world, the specific characters, names, and events depicted in this story are products of creative storytelling. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.